All right, thank you. It's 2 o'clock now, so the hearing is resumed. So before lunch, we heard from the parties around the table, quite an extensive length, and I think we agreed to proceed after lunch with the council's response to those points and a bringing together of the matters to be addressed, I think. So if I could turn to the council, please.
Thank you, sir. We'll try and deal with the points in the order in which they were made in that sequence just before lunch. Deal with Mr. Lane, first of all, who is essentially making points about ST 31. I'll ask Ms. Cook to take up the reins on that, but the point essentially was that that doesn't follow the spatial principles on every instance. I think a general point to be made is that in any case where an allocation doesn't follow precisely every single aspect of the spatial principles, there will be certain very detailed site-specific considerations which need to be taken into account. I can ask Ms. Cook to explain the approach that was taken to ST 31 to illustrate that.
Thank you. We do accept that ST 31 falls within an area of historic character and setting as set out in the evidence base. However, in line with our site selection process and the technical officer process, we did consider evidence that was submitted to us as part of that site, which was accepted. And this evidence set out why the site should come forward. What we have accepted is that there would be minor harm to the urban fringe and reducing of the gap to the village in the main urban area. And it is part of the Preventing Coalescence Parcel G3, which extends from Bishopsthorpe Village to Cottonmouthorpe and northwards to the existing urban edge of the York main built-up area. However, officers consider that the site is severed from the wider G3 area by the railway line and that it is contained and bounded by the existing settlement of Cottonmouthorpe to the west, the East Coast Main Line railway line to the southeast and to the north by Tadcaster Road and the A64 embankment. And although the development of the site would extend this element, we do believe that the impact's reduced by the fact that the site is contained within these it's a triangular parcel and contained within these features. Therefore, officers did actually accept the evidence. And this evidence was presented as part of the 2016 Preferred Sites Consultation document in terms of technical officer comments, which did consider the consideration of greenbelt boundaries as part of its additional information.
So we're reluctant obviously to get into site-specific matters. That was just an illustration of how it may be that even if ST 31, by way of example, doesn't follow every single aspect of the spatial principles to perfection, site-specific considerations have to be borne in mind. And this can be addressed at phase 2 of the hearings, of course. Turning then to Mr. Courier's points, largely in relation to ST 15. Again, similar point, sir. A lot of this is going to be picked up, hopefully, at a later stage. But just a few general points. Insofar as reference was made to figure 7, that was not the beginning of the exercise. Any point about retrofitting is rejected. We say that the strategy was driven by the work which underpinned a layering exercise which led to figure 7, which looked at a number of spatial principles which, when combined, led to figure 7. And that approach has driven the strategy for reasons that we have given. And it's been supported by an evidence base which dates in part from 2003 but has been updated regularly since then, including the documents that I mentioned right at the outset of the hearing today. So figure 7 has driven the strategy in the layered way that I have identified. The next point raised by Mr. Kersey was support the point that had been made by Ms. Fearn about the SLA. And he said there should be a combined approach to assessing site suitability and availability under the SLA process. And we say that's exactly what we've done. For the reasons we've given, we've looked at areas of land where development may or may not be suitable through the application of the spatial principles that I've identified and the figures we've shown. But then we have also applied site-specific assessment through the SLA process, which has quite rightly looked at availability of land from a willing landowner. It's quite unrealistic to somehow downplay the importance of that through setting the distribution of development. So there has been a combined approach followed throughout, as Mr. Kersey would like to see. The next point he raised was on paragraph 52 of the NPPF. He appears to be reading paragraph 52 to mean that it is only possible for you to allocate land as a new settlement if there is some form of demonstrated and confirmed measurable support from the local community. And we say that goes too far in the interpretation of paragraph 52. Obviously, paragraph 52 envisages that communities will be involved in any proposal for a new settlement. And for reasons that we can explain, consultation has taken place and the allocation has been refined and amended to take on board comments that have been made by the public. But the fundamental question to ask is whether the new settlement would allow for sustainable development to be achieved. And the answer to that question is not dependent simply, as Mr. Kersey appears to suggest, on whether communities support the proposition in that respect. So we say the fundamental test is whether sustainable development would be achieved, and it would be in this case for the reasons we've given. Mr. Kersey, sorry.
Forgive me,
Yes.
Mr. Lyons. It is not, of course, for us to interpret what the NPPF says, but merely to read the words. And it says, doesn't it, working with the support of their communities, local planning authorities should consider whether such opportunities provide the best way of achieving sustainable development.
Yes.
Those such opportunities being larger scale developments such as new settlements or extensions and that follow the principles of garden cities. I suppose the question really is, has the council worked with the support of its communities?
I think worked with the support of communities in the sense that consultation has taken place, and where comments have been made by local communities, they have been taken on board in refining the allocation. I don't think we would be in a position to say that every single local consultation response has been one in favour of the allocation. There have been objections to it, but we don't say it then follows from that somehow the allocation should be regarded as unsound. It's difficult to know how support of the communities is actually to be confirmed or measured in any way. We do have to accept that objections have been made to it. But certainly the consultation has taken place, and we have positively taken on board comments about suggestions relating to the allocation that have been made by local communities. And to that extent, we'd say that the work that's been done by the council is entirely consistent with paragraph 52. But if you're asking, sir, have the local residents unanimously turned around and said to the council, we support this allocation? I don't think we could fairly say that that's the case, but we don't say that's the fundamental test to be applied here. Thank you. There was one point that Mr. Kersey made about transport impacts. I wonder if you'd ask that to be dealt with, please.
First thing is that the transport assessment, we've considered it under the requirement to use a proportional evidence base within the MPPF. So the transport modelling that's been undertaken, we consider that that has met that requirement and it's been proportional. In terms of what the modelling does, it determines the impact of the development projections on the highway network over the next 15 years of the planned period. And it models the City of York area at the highest level of detail, generating trips on the network based on the level of development to calculate the traffic flows. So we consider that the evidence put forward is proportionate in that case. The transport modelling has also been used to help identify potential mitigation, which has been listed in the infrastructure delivery plan. There's a significant amount of transport infrastructure in the infrastructure delivery plan, and we've listed that out as it feels the mitigation measures that are reasonable to go forward at this time. The infrastructure delivery plan also includes some transport proposals that were listed as being a reasonable prospect of going forward, which was the Highways England scheme at Hopgrove Roundabout. So there are transport proposals at a strategic level that aren't controlled by the local planning authority or the local highway authority that we also recognise. There was also an issue raised about congestion, I think particularly on the outer ring road. It should be noted that the 2019 transport topic paper shows that the outer ring road, the A1237, actually experiences in one direction a decrease in congestion because there's actually a decrease in the delay time on that stretch of road.
Mr. Good next, please. Mr. Good raised the point about there being only 4% or so of new development in the villages. I'd ask Mr. Davis and Ms. Cook just to pick up on the point that it's unclear the extent to which the council has properly considered the potential for higher levels of development in those locations.
Thank you, sir. I was just going to refer back to the strategic SA work that was done in terms of the spatial distribution. One option, option 2, focused in addition to prioritising development in the urban area and so forth. It also considered distributing development to the villages. And in that regard, then, there was a brief commentary around the effects, both beneficial and negative, and it commented a part on the scale of the development that could be allocated to villages and whether they would be of sufficient scale to provide additional services or not. And I think then that ties into the work undertaken to the SHLA that Mrs. Cook will now explain with regard to access to service.
In relation to how we've dealt with sites through the SHLA, obviously we come back to the point that these are sites that have been submitted to us for consideration with a willing landowner. and in applying our methodology to that in terms of considering access to services and facilities and transport routes, we have actually undertaken as a council a comprehensive survey of our facilities, services and transport, sustainable transport routes such as bus routes, bus stops, park and rides, cycle routes, pedestrian cycleways, etc. And that was used to inform how we'd actually interpreted our scoring and the access to services as part of our strategic housing land availability assessment scoring. That was initially done in 2013 to inform the preferred options assessment. However, we updated this information in 2016, which has gone on to update the scoring as part of the SLA in SD 049. This has included, therefore, consideration of all facilities across the city, including those within villages. And it's in relation to, therefore, how the site has scored in relation and proximity to those services within that village.
Then Mr. Johnson made a number of points by reference to ST 7 and 14 in particular. Well, he mentioned ST 8 as well. Essentially, if I can put it this way, the point was that, well, larger sites, extensions to those allocations would be more viable and sustainable. And he's doing this essentially to tee up his wider objection that the areas of his allocation should be extended. I'll ask Ms Macefield to deal with that, but make the general point that insofar as it's suggested that larger sites have the capability of being more sustainable in terms of viability and contributing to transport and other infrastructure and so on, that always has to be balanced at a site-specific level against other aspects of the spatial principles, including the effect on the historic character and appearance of York. So there's always a balance to be struck, and that was the purpose of the heritage topic paper and the heritage impact assessment, to allow that exercise to be undertaken. Can I ask Ms Macefield if she has any further comment on that?
Yes, thank you. I would just add to that that in terms of the potential benefits of larger sites and the sustainability benefits of larger sites, we have tried to balance that in the plan in terms of looking at other aspects of the spatial strategy and including protecting the historic character and setting of the city, in particular through the heritage topic paper SD 103, which informed our analysis of sites, particularly in terms of reinforcing the settlement pattern of York. We looked at the characteristics of compactness and landscape setting, and in particular, I draw your attention to page 62 of the heritage topic paper, where it talks about elements of landscape and setting and the character element in relationship to the historic city of York and its relationship with surrounding settlements. And the key feature being the relationship of York as a compact city and the clock face of surrounding settlements. And this relationship relates to not simply the distance between the settlements, but also to the size of the settlements and the villages themselves, and the fact that they are freestanding and clearly definable settlements.
I'm sorry, yes, I suspect we'd come back to that when looking at those specific allocations, but those are the general principles at play. The next item I want to deal with Mr. Grundy's point, which came back at an earlier submission that we had made that it was not appropriate to consider urban extensions moving into the green fingers in York. And his reply was, well, we weren't contemplating that as part of our proposition. It's not entirely clear where these urban extensions Mr. Grundy is referring to are supposed to be directed, but to the extent that even they avoid the green fingers in between built aspects of development in York, I was wondering if Ms. Cook, could you deal with this general point about the distribution needing realistically to provide more for urban extensions, please?
In terms of considering urban extensions, we have looked at the evidence base and our understanding of how to apply the evidence base, which key to this, coming back to my colleague's point, is the heritage topic paper and the accompanying heritage impact appraisals, which have been done both for each policy in the plan and for each site that we have looked at as an allocation. In terms of that, when we were looking at urban extensions in previous versions of the plan and moved to those being separated away, that has been a key influence in our understanding to make sure that we conserve the key elements that are important to the historic character and setting of the city, and that has been directly informed by our understanding of the first key principle in Policy SS1, using the Heritage Impacts Assessment and its topic paper.
Thank you. And then Mr. Smith for Historic England made a number of points, but I think the one I'd want to highlight really is the support that he offered for the spatial strategy. In a way, this sort of rounds off the approach that's been taken by the council, and we noted that he said that the distribution was the only one likely to conserve key elements of the historic character and setting of York. And we'd ask you to attach a lot of weight to that support for the approach that's been taken by the council, and it confirms our view as to why the spatial distribution that we're proposing is the most appropriate one.
Thank you very much for that. Useful points there to clarify. There are a number of people who have indicated to speak. Mr. Corsair, you want to kick off, please?
Thank you, sir. Can I just deal with Historic England and so their support, they clearly supported the spatial strategy, but on the proviso, sir, and you'll have read their statement as well as I have. They use very carefully. It's been very carefully phrased, and they were short of decanting the housing need from York, and that's obviously raises the paragraph 14 issue, which clearly we've yet to discuss. So that support, Historic England do recognise the harm which the new settlements will cause. Their point, and a point I think the parish councils I'm representing take the same view, that if you had to have a choice between peripheral development and the new villages, new settlements are preferable. But you actually have there's a third choice, which is not, because those new settlements will cause substantial harm, and so that harm to character and setting is actually recorded in the SA. So it's uncontroversial. I say it's between harm and significant harm is, I think, to criteria 13 and 14. If there is that harm, you clearly, as inspectors, can recommend that part of that need is not met within the Ministry of Area of York. That would follow from national policy. And when you read the submissions which Historic England and we have put in on all matters relating to Greenbelt, other than at one point of whether you should or on decanting, you could barely put a cigarette paper between what we say.
Sorry, sir, can I just have confirmation then? I mean, we understand Mr. Kersey has made this point before about some housing need being met outside the administrative boundaries of York. I'm not going to go into that again, but I took it from what he said that if he loses that point, then he accepts a spatial distribution that involves the creation of a new settlement.
Yes, sir. That's certainly our position, is that obviously, sir, we have slightly muddled the issues, and I don't muddle the issues between duty to cooperate and the issue, the paragraph 14 issue. You do not need to know, our submission to you is that you do not need to know that other authorities will accept the unmet need before you can find that the harm is serious enough to warrant not meeting needs in full. I think that's a fairly fundamental point, which obviously you as inspectors need to grapple with. Because you obviously hear a lot about harm tomorrow on Greenbelt to Greenbelt, and indeed on matters like air quality, congestion, and so forth. Just picking up the other points which Mr. Lyne has mentioned. I don't want to go on about figure 7, sir. We'll deal with that tomorrow. But any suggestion that somehow figure 7 has driven the proposal of the submission local plan can't be true. Figure 7 arises out of evidence which the council has only submitted in relation to purpose of the Greenbelt at your request. It hasn't informed the proposal of the local plan in any way. And so, dealing with NPPF paragraph 52, I think what the council is actually saying is you can put aside, in effect, the word support. Support is not the same thing as consultation with. Again, that's a matter I'll leave with you. I think that's all I want to come back on that. Thank you.
Mrs. Fenn.
Thank you. I just want to raise just a couple of very brief points as a bit of a summary and a final conclusion. Firstly, regarding the site selection methodology, the thresholds that they've used to essentially fast-track the larger sites through the site selection process, which it clearly states they have in the site selection paper, to reduce that threshold from 100 hectares in the 2013 paper down to 35 hectares in the current methodology is just totally unjustified. There's no paperwork to my mind that justifies that reduction whatsoever. And I appreciate that things do change over time with further evidence being available and more detailed evidence. However, a reduction by nearly 2/3 of the threshold is just totally unjustified and in my mind puts into question whether the council are trying to fit these these strategic allocations into their plan and justify them at a later date than they should have originally. Just two more very, very quick points. So strategically, the Greenbelt, as well as other issues, are meant to have shaped where development is directed towards. And the constraints map at figure 3.1 of the local plan is meant to show this. However, it's fundamentally flawed as it doesn't look at the site. It doesn't look at the sites where development can't be brought forward without impacting on the Greenbelt to a significant level based on all 5 purposes of the Greenbelt that the Greenbelt serves. They've simply looked at one and then other constraints. And if that exercise had been undertaken from the start, we would be in a completely different situation now in terms of what sites were brought forward for allocation, and the strategic sites. And finally, sites are required, it's required that sites are chosen to meet requirements based on SS1, ensuring accessibility to sustainable modes of transport. Yet it's found that at least one of the larger allocations completely and utterly fails to meet this policy. As far as I'm concerned, on the evidence that I've seen, the current ST14 as it stands doesn't even include a bush route. So despite the fact that they are proposing certain elements and facilities on site, to me it fails to meet the transport requirements, and that's based on the site promoters' evidence submitted with the their matters statement to this hearing. That's everything, thank you.
Mr. Dennis.
Thank you. Just picking up, obviously we're on point 210 about the distribution of housing justified. Is the plan sound in this regard? I'm still unclear how the council is taking a proactive approach rather than a reactive approach to the top-down version of the master planning. If I could just read you a case study, it'll illustrate the point I'm trying to raise about joining the dots here, and also probably offer a solution as well. And this is the case study from the Swedish city region of Uppsala. In the early 2000s, I'll just read this, there's a couple of paragraphs, it won't take long. In the early 2000s, the Swedish city of Uppsala was facing many of the same challenges that the UK currently faces. These shared challenges were that house builders were not able to meet the demand, especially for social and affordable housing, with the lack of supply leading in part to higher prices, compounded by a very concentrated house building sector, and a state unwilling to engage proactively in the land market in any meaningful way. Unlike the UK, Uppsala decided to take action and developed a new model to deliver the additional housing supply, which works as follows. First, the council identifies the local need and creates the plans for a development that they want to build. It then purchases the land at existing use value. The council then develops the master plan, which is divided into numerous subplots, which are sold to different developers with a commitment to build specific types of housing on them within a given time frame. An interesting feature of the system is that the price the land is sold on to the developers is dependent on what is going to be built, meaning that land is cheaper for social housing than for market rate developments. The changes to Uppsala's house building programme have achieved tangible results and has demonstrated that an active role by local government in land supply does increase the supply of housing, gives a greater role to small volume house builders, and improves the quality and diversity of the properties. In addition, by delivering real results, i.e. building new good quality housing and improved infrastructure, they have managed to secure cross-party support for this, which expands the state's role. The point I'm trying to make, that's what I view as a proactive policy to master planning in terms of how I'm envisaging the local plan here to take that kind of approach. Cool.
Thank you, Mr. Dennis. It seems a very interesting way of doing things, and seems to be quite successful in Sweden, apparently. Mr. Butler.
Thank you, sir. Just a couple of points to come back on, and then just a quick conclusion point, basically. Just the point about this assessment headline figure of 100 hectares down to 35 hectares. I don't think it's as simple as that. There's been many assessments that have taken place in those years that have gone by since that point, and I think we can't ignore the discussions that have taken place with consultees such as Historic England as well. So I don't think it is as simple as what it's made out to be. The point about decanting housing to other authorities, I thought we'd put that to bed last week. It's not a reasonable alternative if no one will accept it. We've got housing needs to meet, so I was hoping that point of discussion might have been. And then the third point is about paragraph 14 of the framework, which Mr. Corsier keeps referring to the point of harm. That's one element of it, of course, and the other element is unless it's significantly and demonstrably outweighed the benefits, which we don't think it does, and we'll cover that point next week as well, of course, in terms of the socio-economic benefits that the plan delivers. The overall approach, and this I suppose is my conclusionary point, if again that is a word, the overall approach is largely soundly based, supported by a number of consultees, but there are anomalies, and we outline them in our hearing statements, and we do believe that those anomalies can be rectified through the examination process and would enhance the sustainability of the plan, and it's probably more for a phase 2 element of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Keogh?
Thank you, sir. Again, just to return to that suggestion by Mr. Corsier that if you find that there is substantial harm, which is inviting you to do to the historic setting of the city, and therefore some of the housing needs of York could be met elsewhere, can I just invite you to reject that outright? At the Harrogate district, the Harrogate local plan, Sites and Policies Local Plan 2013 was considered by your colleague Mr. Ware at an examination in 2014. That local plan essentially offloaded part of Harrogate's housing requirement onto other authorities. When the Harrogate Council were asked which authorities had accepted that housing requirement, the answer was none. There was no agreement with any of the other authorities that they would meet the shortfall in Harrogate's provision. The DPD was proposing 390 dwellings against projections of 862 dwellings. The inspector essentially abandoned the examination, and Harrogate had to start again. So any suggestion that you can simply find there's harm to the setting of York and therefore conclude that someone else can meet York's housing requirement without the agreement of those other councils is simply not an option.
Rachel Maskell.
Thank you. I just want to make some concluding comments, and certainly in response to what I heard from City of York Council, bearing in mind the focus around creating a prosperous city for all and developing a sustainable growth for York. I have to say I believe the responses on transportation have been left wanting. We have to remember that this is ultimately about the citizens of this city, and the fact that today they are breathing in air quality which fails to reach standards, and we know that there are 15 sites where that has been failed. To say that we're going to add substantially to the transport use in York just does not add up. And of course some of these radial routes, they pass schools, which is going to impact on the children of the city and the poor air quality there. And we know that we live in a congested city. And therefore, I have to say, when we're talking about proportionate flows of traffic, and that believing that satisfies future plan, when we're talking about the significant increase in traffic flows in the city, it just does not add up. And therefore, I believe that the council are trying to justify the impact through mitigation, but that mitigation isn't in place. And therefore, it just does not hold together in building a sustainable city for the future. And we've just also got to remember, when we're talking about the housing in the city and meeting the housing needs of people who live here, we have got to get this right, because so many people are struggling. And to get the placement wrong, not to build the connectivity into the housing developments where it is sustainable, means that, again, we're adding to the problems of the city, not taking away from them. And therefore, I just believe the construct of the whole of the plan has been ultimately not addressed the needs of the city. The final point I want to make is around consultation. I hear the word consultation so many times, but as a representative of people within the York Central constituency, I have to say time and time again, my constituents are saying they are not being heard over the crucial factors of the way the city is being developed, whether that's economically, whether it's sustainably, and the environment, whether it is transportation, which is a constant bugbear because it is so the paucity of the situation currently, or over the housing crisis. And getting this development wrong is going to make things worse, and I can see how quickly things could descend, making the cost of housing even more inaccessible, meaning that we won't get the economic development we need, ending up congested and polluted. This cannot be the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Grundy.
Thank you. And I suppose as a rejoinder to Mr. Linus's response, what I was seeking in my comments about green wedges and strays was to draw out the difference between those elements of the proposed green belt that perform extremely well in respect of the 5 purposes and openness, but there are others that don't. And of course, we will come on to those differences in more detail in matter 3.
Okay, very good. And Mr. Merritt.
Pick up the transport issue and Ian Stokes' response from the council. The issue that we have in the city is that there is an incredibly high level of congestion. It's been there in the centre of the city for many decades now. All that has happened is that the throughput is constrained, and therefore, as the ownership and use of private transport has increased, the congestion has spread out, both in time and in extent. So you get congested junctions further and further out in the system. The current way that transport operates in this city cannot cope with the massive development if we just do it on a more as the same basis. If you look at the underlying work that's been done for this plan, it differs from the way, interestingly, previous local plans around the millennium were done, where the local transport policies and approach were developed in conjunction with the local development plan, and actually and influenced where sites were put and the transport policies in that plan. If you actually compare the transport policies that are attached to this plan, they are markedly less ambitious and rigorous than the ones in the 2005 current development control version of the local plan, which reflected that work that was done on transport. And that was then, almost 15 years ago, dealing with a much lower level of development. You can see in terms of what has, in terms of the council's response to the earlier question, the work that they have done is limited has been primarily confined to looking at the highway use by conventional vehicles. It has not focused on putting the alternatives into place in terms of a major step change improvement to the public transport network that is needed if we are going to cope with the expansion of development, to improving the walking and cycling networks. If you look at the policies on particular individual new developments, you'll see a target of 15% of journeys by public transport is suggested. No evidence is offered to justify that target, nor is any target offered for walking and cycling. The targets are far too low to reflect an emphasis on sustainable travel. Similar new developments in the hearts of European cities are achieving sustainable mode shares in excess of 80%. Groningen in the Netherlands, Freiburg in Germany, to name just two comparable sized cities, are achieving much higher active and public modal shares citywide. I know in Groningen, which I visited in the 1990s, they already achieved 50% walking and cycling. That is the order of change that we need to be looking at here, which is not delivered by this local plan, and therefore, in effect, means that it's completely unacceptable in its present form. I'd also make the point that the council has failed in terms of what it should have done in developing the transport side of this plan, that they need to both identify remedial transport measures and assess their impact as part of the transport plan. They have not done the latter, and therefore, and I'm not surprised they haven't done the latter, because it would basically show that the anticipated levels in increase in delays and congestion in the city that are mentioned in their traffic topic paper and which are completely unacceptable will actually happen. The alternative, which is actually more likely, is that the increased congestion will choke off growth in this city. It will continue to choke the city centre and lead to further displacement of jobs from the city centre and a wholly unsustainable pattern of development. And that also links to other aspects of it. So the concentration on increasing densities of development in the city has brought substantial pressures on the residual community facilities. So actually the sites, community facilities in the form of pubs, in the form of green spaces, sports fields. We flagged in our original submission 3 sets of sports fields that were under threat of redevelopment. 2 of those have now gone. You could say the same in terms of local public houses, all those types of things which are disappearing because of the pressure on housing in the city, the high house prices it generates, the high land prices it generates, and therefore the depletion of those facilities that is a direct consequence, in the same way as the high housing prices have led to the highest loss of office accommodation of any city in the country through conversion to residential. So the whole balance that has come out of this document is unacceptable. And I've been struggling to put my finger on it, but I think the problem that we've got is while SS1 outlines the right sort of objectives, it has not put in place there the issue of how you actually address and value and evaluate the trade-offs that do have to be made between those objectives, and has led to a set of proposals which overdevelop in the city without the commensurate level of support facilities and most particularly transport, and has not taken as much advantage and has done the same in terms of the new settlements, where it has reduced the size of those settlements, which means it will afford less community facilities in those developments. That's why there isn't a secondary school, which was envisaged in the previous site allocation for the Winfield site on the south side of the city. So there's been a whole set of unacceptable compromises in this revision of the 2013 plan, which lead to it being far more unsustainable than the previous version, and that leaves it, as I said, particularly on transport and the sustainability side, is actually completely unsound.
Thank you, Mr. Merritt. Perhaps I'm going to turn back to the council there. There's some points which perhaps warrant a response, I think.
And yeah, I'd be grateful if some additional light could be shone on this issue of moving from 100 hectares to the 35, as I understand it.
Yes, I was going to start with that. Sir, I've asked Ms Cook to explain that first of all, please.
We first looked at that, obviously, in the site selection paper, and we've refined our approach moving through as we've progressed through the preparation of the plan. We've done that in consultation, drawing upon Mr Butler's points. We've done that in consultation with our developers, and we've set that process out at each stage of our technical officer comments that we've reported on.
So if you could... if you could just take it step by step. So you initially thought what about 100 hectares? Just so we're all absolutely clear.
We initially sifted 100 hectares out as for the consideration of separate settlements, and their.
Sorry, I didn't follow that. Could you say that again?
So, as part of the site selection process, we had a number of sites submitted to us. In terms of that first sift, in terms of understanding if we could, following the approach that we took at the preferred options to do with the options to identifying a sustainable, a separate settlement, we had a number of, we had limited submissions of sites of a size that we felt would deliver sustainable settlements, and we chose 100 hectares as the first starting point to look at that. However, that was our understanding of what our self-sustaining settlements has been
So
refined.
just forgive me. So initially, the council thought or took the view that sites of 100 hectares or greater could provide a self-sustaining settlement, if I can put it that way. Is that right?
Initially, yes.
And then something happened and the council changed its mind.
Working with our developers and refining our options, we actually undertook, which is set out in the Strategic Housing Land Availability process, what we called, a strategic site framework, where we started to work in depth with the developers to understand and refine the options for the sites across the city, not just the new settlements, but the strategic sites in general. And through that process, we've been working with them to understand and agree, essentially, the boundaries and the site sizes of those settlements. But notwithstanding that there are people around this table who would seek boundary amendments, which we'll come on to at later phases, and no doubt probably tomorrow as well, to deliver sites which they feel are more robust.
So tell me about the 35 hectares.
The judgment on 35 hectares has been a refinement of our process, really, in our understanding of how large a site needs to be able to sustain facilities and services and to provide the transport links. That's formed the basis, I think, of where we are with the site size.
So initially the council thought that to have a self-sustaining settlement you needed 100 hectares or more, but then after some discussion and work with developers changed its mind and thought, and now thinks that 35 hectares is closer to the truth in the council's view. Is that, have I got that right? Why the change? How did you get it so wrong to begin with?
In terms of the initial process that we conducted our call for sites in 2012, which was an initial call for sites for people to submit us development parcels of land. With that, we received limited information and evidence supporting different sites, to be honest. And so we've refined our approach. So although we've looked at that, we've had various stages subsequent to that people have been able to comment on from developers and the public, which has refined how we've considered that. And in doing so, and in recognition to ensure that those need to be, of what those strategic sites and settlements need to provide, we've put those in development principles into the site-specific policies in the spatial strategy section, which is section 2 of the plan. If I can beg your continued forgiveness, it may be that I'm just a little slow today. It does happen from time to time. What were you using to form these judgments? So why in the first place did you think it needed to be 100 hectares? And then why further on down the line did you revise that? I'm not quite following why. How were you measuring this?
I think initially we were looking at it at a high level at the beginning of the process. We were looking at what would be the minimum size of settlement that would be required in order to generate sufficient sustainable facilities in order to sustain a sustainable community. However, through the process, that was then developed and refined, looking at a specific set of site-specific principles for each site. Does it depend on what sorts of facilities you think need to be in a settlement for it to be a sustainable one? I mean, presumably it needs to have enough people living nearby to sustain a shop, maybe, a bus service, maybe, a primary school, maybe. I mean, you tell me, what kinds of things were you looking at? Yeah, those sorts of factors. I mean, it does depend on the location of the settlement. So in the case of ST15, which is the larger settlement, clearly that is further away from the existing urban area and is an entirely new settlement. So it needs to create sufficient facilities within that site entirely to sustain that population in terms of schools, local facilities, shops, etc. But in some cases, such as ST14, the site-specific principles do require a local centre on that site, but also within the site-specific principles, we recognise that provision could be made through, for instance, an overbridge to connect to the existing facilities adjacent in Clifton Moor. So in that case, it wouldn't necessarily need to be 100 hectares in order to make it sustainable. So it was a refinement of those principles that were tested at each stage of consultation and understanding more about the individual settlements in each case and what would be required.
So does whether it's 100 or 35 hectares, put it another way, does the location in relation to other things, other existing services and facilities, that's something that comes into play then, is that what you're saying?
I'm saying yes, it isn't just an arbitrary cut-off point of a certain size of settlement. I think we started off that point when we were looking at the principle of new settlements, but then we've taken into account the location of those settlements and how they connect with existing communities, and then what was required size-wise in order to deliver the set of site-specific principles that we thought were required in order to make those sites work as new communities. And each of those principles, whilst there are a common set of principles, they do vary between the different settlements or sites as set out in the spatial strategy and in each of those detailed site-specific policies for those sites.
So I can understand the idea that where where land is located in relation to existing services and facilities would have a bearing. I get that as a concept. But is it purely about the location of land that has resulted in the shift from 100 to 35, or is it something else? I apologise if you just explained that to me, and if you did, my apologies, I didn't quite follow.
It's been a process of also refining the boundaries in relation to getting that balance against the other spatial principles that we talked about. It is connected to the location of land, but then also it's been influenced by viability assessment in terms of making sure that those sites are viable and deliverable against the principles that we think are important.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, I understand that sites need to be viable and deliverable, but I'm asking specifically about whether they can be self-sustaining and whether there is some kind of size threshold in that regard. And the council seems to be saying that there is a size threshold, but it's the view of what the council thinks that threshold is something that's changed over time. And as I say, I understand the relationship between the site and existing facilities and services will be something that has a bearing, which might mean that the starting threshold is different depending on where the land is. But I'm still not quite clear in my mind, well, frankly, where the 100 and the 35 come from.
I think the answer Ms Cook gave us, it was basically through refinement of understanding what site size could be capable of bearing sustainable transport infrastructure through discussions with developers as part of the site selection process, bearing in mind that this site size was only used as part of the initial stage of site selection. In the SLA at paragraph 2.3.14, it says that sites over 35 hectares were anticipated to be capable of providing facilities and transport connections, so that given this assumption, where these sites do not pass the site scoring, which would have involved the wider application of access to services, they were still taken forward for consideration by technical officers. So I think it was an assumption that was used to avoid knocking sites out at the first stage, but it didn't then preclude the more detailed consideration of those sites at stage 2 as part of the technical officer group, and that's set out in the SLA. So it was basically used as a filtering mechanism to avoid knocking out sites based on the SLA criteria relating to access to transport infrastructure. But it was then, that didn't mean you didn't look at the sites in detail at stage 2. So I think you just have to look at the context in which the 35 hectares was used. It was to avoid knocking sites out at a SLA stage, which we thought merited consideration, not least because of their broader ability to contribute to sustainable transport infrastructure, but that was really a matter looked at in detail at stage 2.
Okay, but avoiding knocking them out at that stage, but if retained at that stage, would they, in the council's view, still be self-sustaining?
That was all looked at in detail in
I think subject to what others would say, I think that was then considered on a allocation by allocation basis after that, so that the question of whether a particular allocation would contribute to sustainable transport infrastructure was looked at by reference to the individual sites concerned. And that's reflected in the way different sites have different requirements under their policy for dealing with sustainable transport infrastructure.
And for the avoidance of any doubt, which sites, just by reference, came into play in all of this?
Bear with us, sir.
It allowed the consideration of site ST7 land to the east of Metcalfe Lane.
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
It allowed the refinement to be considered for land to the east of Metcalfe Lane, which is 34.5 hectares, as set out in policy H1 of the local plan.
Plus other sites of greater hectarage.
But plus other sites, obviously, of greater hectarage over
Sorry,
that
I tell you what,
size.
it would really help me if you could give me
Yes.
the site reference number.
ST7.
ST7.
Yeah, so there's
So-
a list of the housing sites and particular strategic allocations in table 5.1 of the plan with their site hectarages.
So I can run through, if it's helpful, the sites that are over that hectarage. Is that so? ST5 York Central, which is in the main urban area, which is 35 hectares. ST7, which is land to the east of Metcalfe Lane, which is 34.5 hectares. ST8, which is land to the north of Monk's Cross, which is 39.5 hectares. ST9, land to the north of Haxby, which is 35 hectares. ST14, which is land to the west of Wigginton Road, which is 55 hectares. Land to the west of Elvington Lane, which is ST15, which is 159 hectares.
So in principle then, does the council consider all of those sites to be self-sustaining?
We acknowledge that some of those sites do have access to services based upon the methodology that we've employed. But we also acknowledge through the site-specific policies set out in the spatial strategy that each should be supplying, and it's on a site-by-site basis, which I don't have to hand, but I can refer to, will be supplying their own facilities and local centres.
So is it the case that the council considers ST15 to be self-sustaining, but the others to be self-sustaining, so stroke sustainable, on the basis that they draw on other existing services and facilities?
Yes.
But look, I'm very nervous, yes.
Sorry.
Are you certain of it?
Yes, we consider that ST15 is a self-sustaining community. And we've put that in the requirements for that in policy SS13 set out in the spatial strategy section.
So ST15, you say self-sustaining. Those others that you've just told us about, Well, what? You tell me, self-sustaining or not?
We would consider those other settlements to be sustainable. They are self-sustaining in the sense that they do require facilities within those sites, including local centres, say for instance at ST14, but there's a recognition that in those cases they do have connections to existing communities. So in some cases, whilst they require local facilities on the site, they also we're also requiring increased connectivity with facilities and services in those surrounding areas. So for instance in ST14 through policy SS12 we do require a new local centre in order to provide the provision of shops and local facilities within that site. But we also require, for instance, an overbridge or a connection, safe pedestrian and cycle access through to the Clifton Moor site, which is adjacent. So there's a balance across each of those sites, and that's reflected in the site-specific principles that are set out in the spatial strategy policies. But in all cases, we're trying to ensure that those create sustainable communities that are accessible by public transport, that have facilities within them or connected to existing facilities. And they're set out in the policy aims of those site-specific policies in the spatial strategy section.
So is it right for me to say then that the council, well, regardless of what it thinks, whether it thinks that 35 hectares is enough for self-sustaining or not, is irrelevant because sites that are around that size aren't proposed to be self-sustaining in their own right anyway. Is that correct?
Yes, that is correct in the sense that it isn't an arbitrary cut-off point for 35 hectares, and it does depend on the individual settlement and how they connect to the facilities that they're close to. So there are individual requirements on each of those strategic sites. So it's been a refinement of those settlement boundaries. So we started off looking at a certain size of settlement in order to look at what would be required to make a self-sustaining community, but that's been refined through the process we've been through, looking at those correct boundaries and looking at what facilities are required on each of those sites in order to make them self-sustaining, or a sustainable community where they connect to other facilities around them.
So is the point here that we aren't being asked to agree that 35 hectares is the threshold, in inverted commas, for a self-sustaining community? We're not being asked to agree with that because you aren't proposing any self-sustaining settlements of that size.
Yes, that's correct.
But we are being asked to agree that 159 hectares falls within a self-sustaining community category.
Yes.
Thank you. I believe I interrupted your reply.
So I think we're content to leave it there. A number of other points were raised by Mr. Merritt and Ms. Maskell in particular, which largely repeat what we've been dealt with before. At some stage when we were listening to that, we bore in mind what the question you'd raised earlier, which is it's unclear exactly what alternative is being proposed, because on the one hand, we understand that there's a desire to see more development to deal with issues of affordability. On the other, there's a complaint about the prospect of harm being caused by increasing densities in the city. And it's not entirely clear what exactly Mr. Merritt or Ms. Maskell are actually seeking to achieve by way of an alternative spatial distribution. All I would say is
yes,
that...
do forgive me, Mr. Linus. That you may or may not be right, but I'm not sure that we're charged with coming up with that, are we? We're charged, are we not, with working out whether or not the approach that is proposed by the council is a sound one
yes,
or not?
That's entirely understood. I just bear in mind the comment that was made earlier that insofar as objectors appear to complain about whether or not the plan is sound, you've been looking for suggestions as to how it might be improved. And I didn't discern in anything that we've heard from Mr. Merritt or Ms. Maskell a clear indication as to how we should change the spatial strategy. But be that as it may, we say that focusing development where possible in the main urban area provides the best opportunity for achieving sustainable transport choices that appears to be their main aspiration. And similarly, identifying a major new settlement and other new settlements which we say have the ability to contribute towards sustainable travel choices, again, is an entirely acceptable spatial distribution. And to the extent that one must recognise that there will be new traffic to a degree as a result of this spatial distribution, we stand by the proposition that the work that's been done to date is sufficient to demonstrate that overall it can be regarded as acceptable for the purposes of this stage of the plan. And finally, just to confirm Mr. Cursier's point about paragraph 14, we are not in the territory where one should be finding that the harm caused by this plan significantly and demonstrably outweighs the benefits for meeting the housing needs we've identified. And we note his view that if you were to conclude consistently with our case that there isn't a prospect for housing needs to be met outside the York local plan area, that he doesn't have an issue in principle with the new settlement. I'd ask you to note that. Thank you.
Okay, and a few more comments. Mr. Nakris, please.
Thank you, sir. Just listening to that, obviously we're representing ST7 and ST14, and looking at the site selection process back from 2013, it's clear that this takes an approach through, as many site selections do, of identifying sites and then applying them to a scoring mechanism based on access to facilities and things. And the reference to 100 hectares, effectively what that does is acknowledge that some sites of that scale will be located in areas that can't comply with those scores. So what it says in that document is that if you're over 100 hectares, you effectively bypass that second test. So you don't look at being scored against accessibility. You go straight on to phase 3, which is the further assessment. So the 100 hectares wasn't a case of saying it has to be over 100 to be this. It effectively just moved you onto a different part of the scoring mechanism. So ST7, for example, wasn't identified in that process. That was identified because it was smaller than 100 hectares. It went through all 3 stages. So along with other sites, just because it's below 100 hectares doesn't mean that it wouldn't effectively have been allocated. Again, this is part of the confusion, I think, by the fact that they are referred to as garden villages, and almost gives it that idea that they are brand new settlements, and they've been referred to on a number of occasions today as new settlements, whereas they almost, well, they did begin as urban extensions, and they can rely on those facilities, and they can still rely on those facilities, and I think that applies for both of them, and I think that's sort of the response that the council's giving you. And I can't find anywhere where it changes the threshold from 100 to 35, other than the fact that...
Forgive me a moment, Mr. Nax, just not on a... I'm not asking you this question. It's something that I meant to ask the council earlier, and I'm grateful to you for reminding me. Yeah, right. So you've just gone through a list of sites. You have concluded that there's one that you consider to be a self-sustaining community. Which of these do you regard to be new settlements, whether self-sustaining or not? ST15 I take as given.
It's set out in line with the key diagram, so it would be ST7, ST14 and ST15. But if I may add that this is ST7 and ST14 are in the context of the refinement of the boundaries from the urban extensions that we have used. So they were urban extensions, and we have refined those boundaries using our evidence to move them away, to be more in conformity with, we feel, policy SS1 principles.
Thank you for that. My apologies, Mr. Natkus.
I think I had finished, actually. So I'm not sure you did interrupt me. You probably just jumped the gun slightly.
Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, sir. I'll be careful here of not straying too much into the site specifics, because there is clearly a case, and to some extent I support the council in this, is that I've got 2 similar sites of around about 800 or 900 units that act very, excuse me, very differently in terms of their location and working with facilities. And therefore, is ST8 self-sustaining? The answer is probably no, on the basis that it's more or less bolted onto the existing main urban area. And to that extent, the 800 dwellings on ST8 were probably supported by a convenience store on site. With respect to ST7, it's of a similar size to ST8, but it's now made remote from the urban area. And at around about 800 dwellings, you probably will get a convenience store. But is that then self-sustaining? Well, I wouldn't describe a shop as self-sustaining. And my point, hence not straying too much into the debate on ST7, it could be made much better were the boundaries different, because it then can be made closer to the existing urban area. And I think when you talk about larger settlements, self-sustaining, I think the council is right, is that once you get to certainly to around about 3,000 dwellings, you're then talking about a local service centre. But you're not commercially going to get a local service centre on a site of around about 800 dwellings. And I only say that through experience, because I've got a number of sites that I'm currently running, and you end up with a convenience store at around 800 dwellings.
I mean, on the question of self-sustaining, I think it's fair to say that the council agrees with you, doesn't it? Of course, the larger the site, the more self-sustaining it can be relative to its size. And I know what you're after, Mr. Johnson.
Mr. Butler.
I think you said that before. It was just to make the point, it's a similar point but slightly different angle, that I think the hectareage that I mentioned is a quantitative headline that's then started a long process of qualitative assessment in terms of everything we've discussed over the last few days. But the approach that I just wanted to put forward in terms of from the development side of things, the developer side of things, is that we've looked at it, say, bottom up, in terms of assessing the area itself, in terms of the services facilities that are available already, the services facilities that any new allocation / settlement would need, spatial principles, green belt and environmental constraints, absolutely everything over a 6-year period. And I think in a way that's why we've suggested alternative options in terms of what they can deliver and how they can meet those principles. And I think that that's where our elements have come from. And we've not sought to set a threshold or headline limit on hectareage. The hectareage has been formulated by those qualitative assessments, ensuring that these settlements deliver what they need to deliver to be self-sustaining and also to provide sustainable connections to the surrounding main urban area, from a viability point of view as well, in terms of what we can afford to deliver in terms of bus routes through sites and underpasses and things like that. So I think there is that qualitative element that underpins all of this assessment work.
Thank you. Mrs. Fern.
Thank you, yes. Just a couple of brief points to pick up from what the council have said regarding the 100 hectares, 35 hectares situation. What we'd be interested to know is whether any sites that were sieved out as part of the 100 hectare threshold, so that was those sites that didn't meet 100 hectares, so were lower than 100 hectares, that didn't meet the criteria for selection process, which include access to public transport networks and access to facilities, whether there's any of those sites that were excluded very early on in the situation, at the start of the local plan, that actually under the 35 hectare threshold would actually be successful through the local plan process.
Do you think that some were, Mrs. Fern?
I can't be 100% certain on that because it's not something I've looked at in detail, but I would imagine there were quite a lot of sites that were sieved out of that process. The other quick point was the fact that in the timeline between 2013 and the site selection paper era and the call for sites and now, it's extremely convenient. I don't wish to point fingers as such, and I'm not that kind of person, but it seems extremely convenient that the threshold was reduced as part of that process once discussions had been undertaken with the developer, of which that particular site had been reduced by more than half its size, so it fell below the 100 hectare threshold. Just seems slightly convenient. And just one last point. I get the point that ST14 is closer to the urban area of York than the likes of ST15. I can't deny that. However, we've undertaken quite a lot of assessments, and that will come as obviously part of the phase 2 discussions regarding accessibility of ST14, and it doesn't meet any of the government requirements in terms of walking distances to facilities that aren't proposed to be on ST14. We submitted it as part of the Matter 1 statement in terms of climate change, but we will be submitting that evidence in phase 2 should we get there.
Mr. Cossier.
Thank you. I want to go back to this question of thresholds, because you won't be surprised to know there's been a lot of research about this matter for new settlements, and unfortunately I haven't brought it with me, but I'm going to, from what I recall, I'll check it overnight to make sure I'm correct what I'm saying. But what my recall is about 10,000 units is what's deemed to be a self-sustaining settlement normally. That will offer a full range of facilities. 5,000 units will reduce you a secondary school. That obviously is very important for being self-sustaining. And of particular note, I think there's acceptance in some of the council documentation that ST15 won't support a secondary school. So therefore, it will not be it won't be self-sustaining in the normal sense of that word. Below 5,000 units, you are going to support some basic convenience facilities, somewhere in the range of 2,000 to 4,000. It's sort of where we are in terms of ST15. You will get probably a convenience shop, you might get a hairdresser, you might get a few other basic facilities of that nature. But those are not going to be dealing with the majority of people's needs. You'll be able to get a pint of milk if you run out, but that's not the notion of self-sustaining. And so I haven't got it in front of me, but there is a figure given in the Garden Communities document from MCLG, which I'll look up overnight, about what they say the figure is, and that's much in the higher range. And of course, to be self-sustaining, you need to be mixed use. Not mixed use in terms of having a retail centre and a few other bits and pieces put up, but you have to have a significant employment element. None of these so-called new settlements have an employment element, substantial employment element. And so the terms of public transport, I know I've already referred to today, but if you look at the policies, and just overnight, I suggest you look at SS13, little 14, where it says that there's talking about public transport services and envisages that such measures will enable upwards of 15% of trips to be undertaken using public transport. That must mean that the majority of trips are going to be car-borne. And just on the proposals map, it baffled me when I was told that that distinguishes the new settlements. Because I see no notation on that of new settlements. I see strategic sites, but I see nothing that differentiates between strategic sites and new settlements. And as I say, there seems to be some confusion even within the council whether they're proposing 2 or 3 new settlements. And so just dealing with the paragraph 14 case, I don't want that, I know there have been a few comments around the table about that, sir, but that needs proper consideration at some point during the examination. I don't think the comments up to now, we would like to present you a proper case on that matter, and we just would like to be told when you would like us to present that. Thank you.
Sir, can I just jump in? I've sat very, very...
it appears as though you have.
Uncharacteristic, but I've now been provoked. And I wonder if I could just respond to that last point. In Appendix 5, sir, of our Matter 2 paper, we give you some references to government publications on sustainable garden villages, and we take you to MHCLG's publication of August 2018, the Garden Communities Prospectus, which identifies a critical mass of between 1,500 and 10,000 new dwellings. And in our representation, sir, at the Reg 19, so this is SID 378, and Appendix 4 to that, you will find a master plan and visioning document which says a little bit more in terms of the detail of what can be provided. It's just to come back on this notion that you have to be 10,000. And otherwise I'll come back to that in part 2.
So can I just respond? Clearly, the 10,000 is when you're trying to get a fully self-sustaining community. I don't have that document in front of me. I think I read it again last night just to remind myself, but I think the 1,500, the garden communities obviously the government has actually taken garden communities from being, if you want, urban extensions, which are designed next, bit like Metcalfe Lane, right through to the type of thing we're talking about at ST15. And I don't think anyone would claim that 1,500 units would produce a self-sustaining community.
Thank you. Thank you for the clarification and the quick reference there as well.
Sorry, Ms. Cook, just had one more point on the garden villages.
Yes,
aspect.
you can.
To pick up on Ms. Cook's point, we have actually received funding from the Homes and Communities Agency as part of that garden village funding, and we'll be commencing discussions with Homes England with them in 2020, in January 2020, together with the site developers to take forward ST15 as a garden village under that scheme.
And sorry, the reference to the 1,500 homes appears in paragraph 5 of that prospectus document.
Thank you.
We'll prioritise proposals more than 10,000, but we'll consider proposals for garden villages 1,500 to 10,000 homes, which are strong in other aspects.
Mr. Lane.
Thank you, sir. Just so you're not under the wrong impression, the sites that were referred to by the council as being 35 hectares or more, not all of them have the same characteristics. So ST5 is in the urban area, as you know. ST9 at north of Haxby is very well related to the services facilities in Haxby, easily walkable and commutable to those. So not all of the settlements and sites are the same. That's all I want to say, sir.
Mr. Merritt.
I just wanted to pick up some of the issues relating to this particular sub-discussion. We talked about public transport accessibility. The needs in terms of journeys from the dormitory communities into town, we will still have the same challenge of accommodating those journeys in the city, so the use of public transport is quite important. And there's a difference between accessibility to public transport and actually having a public transport service that will make a significant difference. Can I just finish the point?
No. Could you just pull your microphone slightly
sorry.
closer? I'm not hearing you very well.
Yeah.
Can I just check, can everyone else hear well enough? I'll take
Apologies.
the silence as a yes.
Sorry, I was just trying to make the point. There's a difference between access to public transport and a public transport service that will actually attract a significant level of use and is in effect available all week round. If you look at existing dormitory communities around York, you'll find some that don't have Sunday services, that have a week or non-existent evening services, and those and very infrequent day services. Those are not attractive in terms of getting significant numbers of people to use public transport. It's in effect they're a residual social public transport service only. The people who will be inevitably working in the city or travelling further afield by rail or whatever still will have to get into the city, and if they all come in by car because the local public transport service is not of the quality or sufficiency that they want, then we still have the major traffic problems in the city. So you do need to take into account what is the size of community and its location relative to existing public transport services, viable public transport services, as to whether it will have a genuine, reasonable quality public transport service. And generally speaking, that's at the 10,000 end of the spectrum, unless it happens to be one of the previous urban extensions that are now separated, that happen to happen to be very close, and in effect can be served by an extension of an existing public transport service at a more modest cost. The ones that are freestanding well out into the green belt, like ST15, will struggle to deliver a reasonable public transport service at the size it has now been reduced to.
Thank you. Mr. Smith?
Thank you, sir. I'd just like to go back to the issue of the new settlements, where there's 2 or 3. The council have been at pains to argue that the new settlements reflect the relationship which the existing settlements have to the main urban area, the necklace of settlements around the ring road. And to that extent, ST14 and ST15 do that. ST7, however, is setting a new precedent. There is nothing that close to the edge of the existing urban area within the ring road, and ST7 is akin to an iceberg that's sort of broken off the main Antarctic landmass and appears to be sort of floating out towards the ring road. In terms
I don't want to go back to the question of climate change again.
It seems a strange anomaly in terms of their strategy, and certainly the support that Historic England gave for the sort of principle of new settlements was in relation to those 2 outside the ring road, and not to ST7 as it is currently depicted within the key diagram.
Thank you for that clarification. Mr. Nakos, and then if I can ask the council if it needs to come back after that. Thank you.
Thank you. So I won't comment on the merits. I think we are starting to stray into a little bit of stage 2. It was just to highlight the point that it was almost implied that some of the sites had sort of skipped a stage because they're over 100 hectares and then been reduced down in size and effectively cheated the system. But I don't think that's the case, having looked at the background papers. And again, just to flag to you, figure 7, I think it is in TP1, which we'll touch on tomorrow, does show settlements and locations that have access, well, 800 metres to 2 or more services, and the sites that we've been talking about are shaded white in those areas. So from ST7, ST14, you can get to 2 or more services. So they haven't effectively cheated the system by going big and then gradually being reduced down in size. They do meet the criteria anyway.
Thank you for that. Yes, if you'd like to come back on.
Just on that point, figure 7 actually shows you the access to services that we have used as part of the site selection process. It's, if you will, an inverse of, we've looked at access to those services, and that shows you the inverse of the areas that are not covered by services.
That's just to clarify, that's figure 7 in TP1, isn't it?
Yes, sir, yes.
You, sir, have nothing more to add.
Okay. Does anybody have anything else, any points to raise on this?
I do.
Then please fire away.
Yeah, I just wanted some clarification on Mrs. Fern's point, just to be sure, about whether any sites have been sieved out as a result of the 100 hectare threshold.
So I think we need to check that rather than give an answer off the cuff now. Can we note that as an action point?
A homework item.
A homework item, yes.
I know you don't know the answer to that now, clearly. In principle, though, if they have, is that a problem?
All of the, we don't think so, all of the sites that we have considered as reasonable alternatives are set out in the sustainability appraisal, and a consideration of strategic sites in particular are set out in Appendix I of CD 009 and Appendix K, which sets out the audit trail of all the strategic sites we have considered and how we have looked at them through and across the process.
I think what you're saying there is that you don't think that any have been sieved out. Is that right? But you're going to check.
Yes, that's correct, but we'll check and produce the note to add to clarify the sieving point in relation to the 35 and the 100 hectares that Ms Fern raised earlier.
But what about the question I asked, which was, if you have sieved some out, if you're wrong, and you have inadvertently or otherwise sieved some out, is that a problem?
We don't think so, sir, because we think that the approach to reasonable alternatives that was taken in the SHLA is robust. I think that's the short answer we can give for the moment. We're probably better refining that as necessary once we've checked and done our homework.
Okay, so is that a sort of potential bit of supplementary homework? That if the first bit of homework reveals that some have been sieved out, you'll then also provide in your response to us your position in relation to whether or not that sieving out has created an issue.
Yes.
And presumably, if it has created an issue in your view, what are you going to do about it?
Yes, you have the point, sir.
I'm conscious of the time there. Is there anything else under the spatial distribution that anybody has a burning desire to share with the group? No. Okay. And is the council happy with its where we are? Okay, and then in that case then, what I'm proposing is that perhaps brings a draw to the proceedings today, if everyone is happy with that.
Yes, sir. Can I just raise one point about tomorrow and the day after? As we've been reviewing the hearing statements on green belt matters, it's quite clear that there are a number of developers who are promoting allocations who may want to change the boundary of those allocations for one reason or another. Now, we'd anticipated that that would be a matter more naturally falling within Phase 2, even though it may relate to a potential alteration to greenbelt boundaries, but we just wanted to check that as a first point. The second point is that conversely, there are a few hearing statements from developers who are clearly wanting to promote what would be regarded as emission sites, and they are suggesting that the green belt boundary has been drawn incorrectly in the particular location of those emission sites. Now again, that raises the prospect
Yes, they have a habit of doing that.
Yes. Now, bearing in mind the time that we have and the approach that's been taken, we just wanted to clarify what you would find most helpful, because we understand it's a bit like sustainability appraisal. There's a balance to be struck, and it's not entirely clear where it should fall, and that applies in relation to essentially emission sites promoting an alternative green belt boundary. We're quite aware that there are broader issues of methodology and approach which others have raised, but it's those two categories that we just wanted to check with you. We'd assumed, as I've said, in the case of proposed site allocations, that debates over the boundaries of those would be more naturally dealt with at a later stage. The greater difficulty comes with developers who are essentially promoting emission sites through specific points raised on the green belt boundary.